The clock in the hallway struck midnight with a hollow, distant sound that seemed to echo through the quiet house. The rain outside had softened into a whisper against the windows, like the breath of the night itself. Daniel lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, his mind too restless to surrender to sleep. The house felt both familiar and foreign, a place filled with his wife's childhood memories, and now, for a few days, his own uneasy ones. He turned on his side, listening. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked softly. Then came the faint rustle of fabric, followed by the quiet sound of bare feet on polished wood. He held his breath without meaning to, uncertain why the sound stirred something inside him. Curiosity, maybe, or just the awareness of not being alone in the dark. A shadow moved near the doorway, and then the door opened just a little. Warm light from the hallway spilled across the floor. "Daniel!" A voice whispered, soft, careful. He sat up slightly. "Linda!" Her name came out more gently than he intended. His wife's mother stood in the doorway, wearing a light robe, her hair loosely gathered at the back. In the dimness, her face looked younger than usual, the tiredness of the day softened by the pale light. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said quietly. "I couldn't sleep. The storm, I guess." He smiled faintly. "Me neither." There was a pause, the kind that lingers between people who know each other well enough to be comfortable, yet not so well that silence feels easy. She hesitated before stepping inside. "I was making tea," she said. "Chamomile. Would you like some?" He nodded. "That sounds good." When she turned to leave, the hem of her robe brushed lightly against the doorframe. Something about the small human sound, the fabric, the movement, felt intimate in a way he didn't expect. He followed her down the hall, the faint scent of lavender from her robe lingering in the air between them. In the kitchen, the lights were dim, just one lamp near the counter casting a golden glow. The rain outside tapped gently against the window, and steam curled from the kettle like a ghost of warmth. Linda poured the tea with slow, deliberate movements, her fingers steady. "You always liked this kind, didn't you?" she asked. Daniel blinked. "You remember?" She smiled faintly. "You've been part of this family for years, Daniel. I remember small things. Sometimes those are the ones that stay." He looked at her, really looked, and realized he had never noticed how expressive her eyes were. They weren't just kind. They carried a quiet strength, the kind that comes from years of both love and disappointment. She handed him a cup, their fingers brushing for a second. The touch was nothing, an accident, a fraction of warmth, but it stayed with him longer than it should have. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. The ticking of the old wall clock filled the silence, steady and almost comforting. "It's strange being here without her," Daniel said at last. Linda nodded, wrapping her hands around her cup. "It must be. She loved this house. She always said it felt like it remembered people." He smiled. "That sounds like her." "Maybe it remembers too much," Linda said softly. "Sometimes I think the walls hold on to things we'd rather forget." He looked at her again, noticing the faint sadness behind her calm tone. "Are you talking about yourself?" She gave a quiet laugh. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just being dramatic. It happens after midnight." He chuckled. "You and your daughter both. You even sound the same when you say things like that." That made her look up sharply, as if the comparison surprised her. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither looked away. There was no intention in it, no danger, only a sudden, deep awareness of the other. It was the kind of moment that stretches too long to be casual, yet too fragile to define. She looked down first, tracing her finger along the rim of her cup. "She gets her stubbornness from me too," she murmured. "I noticed," he said softly. Silence again, not heavy but full. The rain grew steadier outside, and somewhere in the distance thunder rolled faintly, more like a sigh than a threat. Linda stood and went to the window, looking out into the night. "Do you ever think about how different life would be if we'd made other choices?" Daniel frowned slightly. "Sometimes. But then I think maybe we always end up where we're supposed to." She turned her head just enough that he could see the half-smile on her lips. That's a comforting thought. He joined her by the window, the warmth of the tea still in his hand. The glass was cool beneath his fingers. Beyond it, the garden shimmered faintly in the rain, silver leaves catching the porch light. It's beautiful, he said. It is, she agreed. But lonely too. I think beauty always has a touch of loneliness in it. Their shoulders were close, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. Not touching, just near. The nearness itself was its own quiet current. Linda turned toward him then, her face lit softly by the lamp. For a heartbeat, they stood in silence, neither moving away. The air between them felt charged, alive with everything unsaid. I should let you sleep, she said finally, though her voice was almost a whisper. He hesitated. Thank you for the tea. She smiled, a small, tender smile that reached her eyes. Good night, Daniel. When she passed him, her hand brushed lightly against his arm. Again, just a small human thing. But he felt it like the memory of warmth that stays long after it's gone. He watched her walk down the hallway until the soft light of her room faded behind a closed door. The house fell quiet again. Daniel stood there for a long time. His heart steady but not calm. There was no guilt, no forbidden thought. Only the strange, unspoken recognition between two people who understood something about each other that words could never quite name. When he finally returned to his room, the sheets were still cool, the night still restless. He lay awake, listening to the rain, wondering if she too was lying awake. Thinking, remembering, feeling the same soft ache that came not from desire, but from something far more complicated. Morning came slowly, spilling light into the corners of the house like water finding its way through cracks. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and cool. Birds sang somewhere beyond the kitchen window, and the world seemed softer for a moment, as if the night's quiet tension had been folded away, tucked carefully between the hours of darkness and dawn. Daniel was already awake when he heard the sound of movement downstairs, the clinking of dishes, the faint hum of the kettle. He lingered in bed for a while, trying to make sense of his own restlessness. Sleep had come only in brief, uneven stretches, and when he closed his eyes, he saw not dreams, but fragments of conversation. Her voice, her eyes, the brush of her hand on his arm. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed, forcing himself up. When he came down to the kitchen, Linda was already there. She wore a light sweater over her nightclothes, her hair pulled back loosely, and the morning sun through the window touched the edges of her face with gold. "Good morning," she said, glancing over her shoulder as she poured coffee. "Morning," he replied, trying not to sound as uncertain as he felt. "I made extra. You look like you could use it." He smiled faintly, taking a seat at the table. Was it that obvious? She brought 2 mugs to the table and sat across from him. "You were up late," she said softly. "I heard you moving around." He nodded, looking down into his coffee. "Couldn't really sleep. Too many thoughts, I guess. About her." He hesitated. "About everything." Linda took a sip, her expression thoughtful. "Grief has strange shapes," she said finally. "Sometimes it looks like guilt. Sometimes it feels like remembering things we didn't mean to remember." Daniel looked at her, unsure whether she was talking about him or herself, or maybe both. "I didn't mean to stay up," he said after a moment. "I just didn't want to close my eyes." Linda nodded, her gaze steady. "I know that feeling." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that happens between people who understand each other without needing to fill the space with words. Outside, sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns on the floor. Linda reached for the sugar bowl, her hand moving slowly, almost absently. "Do you ever feel," she began, then stopped, searching for the right words, "like you're still waiting for something that isn't coming back?" Daniel took a long breath. "Every day." Her lips pressed together slightly, as if she understood too well. "I thought it would get easier," she said quietly. "But sometimes it just changes shape." He wanted to say something to comfort her, but words felt too small. Instead, he simply reached out and rested his hand gently over hers. It was instinct, not decision. Her hand was warm, soft, still. She didn't pull away. For a moment neither moved. The sunlight caught the edge of her wedding band, a small glint of gold that seemed to hold the weight of years. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly. "For what?" "For, I don't know. For everything." She gave a small, tender smile, the kind that forgives without needing to name what it forgives. "You don't need to be sorry for being human, Daniel." The words lingered in the air, gentle but heavy with meaning. After a moment, she withdrew her hand, though her touch left behind a faint warmth that didn't fade right away. She stood, took a breath, and began clearing the table. "I'll be in the garden," she said softly. "The roses need trimming." He watched her leave, her movements graceful and quiet, like someone trying not to disturb the stillness of the morning. Later, when Daniel joined her outside, the sun was high, and the grass sparkled with the last traces of rain. Linda knelt beside a row of roses, wearing gardening gloves and humming faintly to herself. The sound of her voice was light, almost like memory. "You really love this garden," he said, walking closer. She looked up, squinting slightly in the sun. "It's been my sanctuary," she admitted. "A place where things make sense. You tend to something and it grows. You neglect it and it fades. Simple rules." Daniel crouched beside her. "Maybe that's why I never had much luck with plants," he said, smiling. She laughed softly. "You just have to be patient. They respond to patience." For a while they worked side by side, trimming, clearing leaves, tying small green stems to wooden stakes. The rhythm of it was calming, wordless. Occasionally their hands brushed, and each time neither commented, though both noticed. At one point, Linda looked over her shoulder at him, her eyes bright beneath the sunlight. "You know," she said, "I used to wonder what kind of man would make my daughter happy. I never imagined it would be someone like you." Daniel froze for a second. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" She smiled. "A surprising thing." He chuckled, but her words stayed with him. Not just the meaning but the tone. Kind, wistful, perhaps even a little too sincere. By late afternoon, they had filled 2 baskets with trimmed branches and fallen petals. The air smelled of wet soil and sunlight, and when Linda stood, brushing off her gloves, she winced slightly. "You're back?" he asked. She nodded, laughing lightly. "Too many years of bending over these roses." Without thinking, he stepped closer. "Here," he said softly. "Let me." He stopped himself, but she didn't move away. Instead, she turned her back slightly toward him, a wordless agreement. Daniel hesitated only a moment before resting his hands gently on her shoulders. His thumbs pressed softly through the fabric, careful, respectful. He felt the tension there, the years of work, of weight carried quietly. "That's better," she whispered. "Tell me if it's too much," he said, his voice low. "It's fine," she murmured. "It's nice." For a few quiet seconds, the world seemed to slow down. The sound of distant birds, the warmth of the sun, the faint rhythm of her breathing. When he stepped back, she turned to face him. There was something in her eyes. Gratitude, yes, but something else too, something unspoken. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded. "Any time." The air between them felt different then. Not charged, not dangerous, but fragile like glass. Both seemed to sense it, though neither named it. As the day faded into evening, Linda went inside first. Daniel stayed behind for a while, watching the light change, the garden turning gold, then blue, then gray. He thought about her laugh, her calmness, the sadness that lived behind her composure. He thought about the strange comfort he found in her presence, a comfort that frightened him just a little because it felt too natural. When he finally went inside, the house smelled faintly of tea and something baking. From the kitchen doorway, he saw her at the stove, her back to him, humming again. She turned when she noticed him, smiling in that quiet, knowing way she had. "I made dinner," she said. "I hope you're hungry." He was, but not only for food. He was hungry for the calm, for the sense of belonging that had been missing for so long. And as they sat across from each other once more, the candles flickering between them, Daniel realized that what bound them wasn't desire, but something deeper. A shared loneliness, an understanding that two people can find solace in each other's company even when the world insists they shouldn't need it. The days that followed unfolded in quiet rhythm. The house seemed to breathe differently when it was just the two of them. Slower, calmer, touched by something unspoken. Daniel found himself slipping easily into the stillness of Linda's world, where mornings began with coffee and soft conversation, and evenings ended with the whisper of the garden breeze through open windows. Neither of them mentioned the night of the storm or the moment in the kitchen. It had become part of the silence between them, not forgotten but folded away gently, like a letter not meant to be opened yet. By Thursday, the air had turned warm again. The weekend promised clear skies, and Linda suggested a small drive to the lake a few miles north. "You could use some fresh air," she said with a smile. "And I could use someone to carry the picnic basket." Daniel laughed. "You planned this, didn't you?" "Maybe," she said, her eyes glinting. "Maybe I just wanted company." They left late in the morning. The car windows were down, the wind playing with strands of her hair. Daniel glanced at her once or twice. She looked peaceful, lighter than he had seen her in years. The sunlight traced her profile in gold, and he had to look away before the thought lingered too long. At the lake, they spread a blanket near the edge of the water. The air was filled with the scent of pine and sun-warmed earth. Linda unpacked sandwiches, fruit, and a thermos of tea. "This place hasn't changed," she said softly, gazing out across the lake. "I used to bring her here when she was little. She'd spend hours trying to catch frogs." Daniel smiled. "She told me about that once." Linda laughed, a soft melodic sound that seemed to settle somewhere inside him. She hated mud but somehow always ended up covered in it. They ate in companionable silence for a while. The surface of the lake shimmered like glass. Somewhere far off, a heron lifted into the air, its wings unfolding in slow grace. "It's strange," Daniel said finally, "being here without her. I almost feel guilty for enjoying it." Linda looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Maybe that's what she would have wanted, for you to keep finding beauty in the world." He didn't answer right away. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not easy," she said. "But it's necessary. Otherwise grief just becomes another way of disappearing." Her words settled in the air between them, gentle but unavoidably true. After lunch, they walked along the edge of the lake. The water lapped softly at the shore, small ripples touching their feet. Linda bent down once to pick up a smooth stone and held it in her palm. "Feel that," she said, handing it to him. "It's warm from the sun. Solid. Real." Daniel turned it over in his hand. "You sound like you've thought about that before." She smiled faintly. "When you lose people, you start paying attention to what stays." For a moment he couldn't speak. He just stood there looking at her, the calm in her eyes, the way her voice carried both strength and sorrow. He wanted to say something, to thank her, to tell her how much her presence meant, but the words stayed locked somewhere in his chest. Instead, he simply nodded and slipped the stone into his pocket. They found a bench near a cluster of birch trees. The shade was cool, the light flickering through leaves like water. Linda leaned back, her eyes half closed. "I used to come here after my husband died," she said quietly. "It was the only place that made sense. Everything else felt too loud, too alive." Daniel turned toward her. "I didn't know." She shrugged lightly. "I didn't talk about it much. People don't know what to say when grief lingers too long." He watched her, trying to imagine the years of solitude hidden behind her calmness. "You're stronger than you look." That made her laugh softly. "I'm not sure that's true. I just learned how to keep moving. Maybe that's what strength really is." She looked at him then, a long, quiet look that seemed to hold a question he couldn't quite name. The air between them felt fragile again, like the pause before a confession. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice low, Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like you're just filling the space they left behind? He swallowed, the truth catching in his throat. Every day. Their eyes met and didn't turn away. Something shifted, not wrong, not forbidden, just deeply human. Linda reached out slowly, almost hesitantly, and brushed a leaf from his shoulder. Her hand lingered a second too long, fingers trembling just enough to betray what words couldn't say. Then she withdrew, exhaling softly. We should head back soon. He nodded, though neither of them moved. When they finally packed up and returned to the car, the air had changed, lighter on the outside, heavier within. The drive home was quiet, but not empty. The silence carried meaning, unspoken and delicate. As they approached the house, the sun was beginning to set. The sky was streaked with gold and rose, and Linda reached forward to turn down the radio. "Stay for dinner?" she asked, not looking at him. Daniel hesitated. "Of course." She smiled, still facing the window. "Good." Inside, the kitchen filled again with soft light and the smell of food. Rosemary, olive oil, the slow simmer of something warm. Daniel set the table while Linda moved around the room with quiet efficiency. At one point, their hands brushed again as they reached for the same dish. Neither pulled away this time. The touch was brief, simple, and yet it carried the weight of everything they hadn't said all day. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" "For being here." He looked at her, really looked, and saw the tenderness, the strength, the loneliness she never spoke of. After dinner, they lingered at the table, the candles burning low. The conversation drifted from small things, old family memories, stories of the garden, favorite books, to quieter, more personal truths. And when she laughed, her eyes soft with warmth, Daniel thought he had never heard a sound both so beautiful and so painful at once. When he finally rose to leave, she walked him to the hallway. The night was still, the only light coming from the lamp near the stairs. "Good night," she said softly. "Good night, Linda." She smiled, and for a moment it felt as though time stopped. Then she stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough for him to feel the warmth of her presence, the faint scent of her perfume, the quiet steadiness of her breath. "Sleep well," she whispered. He nodded, unable to find words. And as he turned toward his room, he realized that the most powerful connections are not always built on desire or impulse, but on silence, restraint, and the ache of everything left unspoken. The days that followed their trip to the lake passed like the slow turning of pages. Nothing was said about what had happened, and yet everything between them had changed. The air carried it. The pauses carried it. Even the smallest glances held something that hadn't been there before, an awareness, quiet but undeniable. Linda moved through the house as she always did, tending to her plants, reading in the afternoons, humming softly when she cooked. But every so often when Daniel entered the room, her movements would pause for just a heartbeat too long. And every night when he lay awake, the sound of her footsteps in the hallway would pull him from the edge of sleep, gentle, familiar, like the whisper of something he could never reach. It wasn't desire that troubled him most. It was the tenderness, the feeling that she understood him in a way no one else did. And that somehow felt far more dangerous. One evening about a week later, the two of them sat outside on the porch. The summer air was thick with the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. The sun had just slipped below the trees, leaving the sky washed in shades of lavender and rose. Linda held a glass of wine, turning it slowly in her hands. Daniel sat beside her, his elbows resting on his knees, watching the horizon. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said quietly. He nodded. "Yeah. Back to work on Monday." She smiled faintly. "You've been good for this house. It's been less quiet." He looked at her. "You mean less lonely?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment she didn't deny it. Then she exhaled softly. "Maybe." The crickets sang in the tall grass. A warm wind stirred the leaves. "I don't think I've ever thanked you properly," Daniel said after a moment. "For letting me stay here. For everything. You don't need to thank me." "I do," he said. "You've been kind. You've made this place feel safe again. Her smile faltered. You've done the same for me. Silence fell between them again. Soft, dense, and full of meaning. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It's strange, isn't it? How life brings people together in ways it shouldn't. Daniel looked down, his throat tightening. Yeah. She turned her face toward him, her expression open but sad. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met at a different time? Different circumstances? He hesitated. Sometimes. She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back toward the darkening garden. I think about it too. And then I remind myself that love, real love, isn't always about being together. Sometimes it's about understanding when not to be. The words hit him like a slow wave, gentle but unstoppable. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he felt the same ache and the same quiet gratitude. But when he tried to speak, the words caught somewhere in his chest. Instead, he reached out, not to pull her closer, not to cross a line, but simply to rest his hand over hers. Her fingers curled around his, warm and trembling. For a long moment they stayed like that, two people bound not by touch, but by everything unspoken between them. Then Linda smiled, a small, sad, beautiful smile, and drew her hand away. Come on, she said softly. You should start packing. He nodded, though neither of them moved right away. When he finally stood, she rose with him. They lingered at the edge of the porch, side by side, watching the last light fade. Thank you, Linda, he said quietly. For what? For seeing me. Her eyes shone faintly in the dusk. You've been easy to see, Daniel. They stood there for a moment longer, and then she stepped closer, just enough to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. It was light, almost motherly, but it carried a tenderness that words could never hold. Good night, she whispered. Good night, he said, his voice barely steady. He turned to go, but looked back once. She was still standing there, framed by the soft glow of the porch light, her expression unreadable, calm, kind, and infinitely human. The next morning, the house was quiet again. He packed his bag, folded the blanket from the guest room, and paused for a moment at the kitchen doorway. The teapot sat on the counter, the same one she'd used that first night. He smiled faintly. When he left, he didn't wake her. There were no goodbyes, no final words. Only a note on the table, written in his careful hand. Thank you for the peace you gave me. I won't forget it. Linda found it an hour later. She read it twice, then pressed the paper to her chest. Outside, the garden shimmered with morning light, and the roses swayed gently in the wind, their petals soft, trembling, alive. She stood there for a long time, letting the quiet fill the space between memory and acceptance. And though neither of them ever spoke again about those days, they both carried something from them. Not regret, not longing, but a quiet gratitude for the kind of love that doesn't need to be claimed to be real.